So it's, what are we at? January 26th. So it's still part of that new year season for us because the year just kicked off. This week, a lot happened, right? We have a new Congress, we have a new president, and for many, we have all these resolutions that we have made or are making, and these resolutions are resolutions we make for ourselves. It's that time of year. It's just the time to think, hey, maybe I want to do this or maybe I want to do that. And we get laser focused in this time of year, in January. We get laser focused on self-improvement. We want to get healthier. We want to lose some weight. We want to build some muscle. We want to get out of debt and we want to achieve more, right? And we have said that is valuable. But as we said throughout the series, there's a far better focus for us than just ourselves. And so rather than us asking the question, what can I do for me? Rather than that be our focus, this year in 2025, we're saying a far better question is, what needs to be done around me? Not just going to focus on me, but what needs to be done around me. In other words, if you want to be a better person this year, and I hope there's always that sense of, yeah, I want to improve, I want to be a better person, then how about we do something in our world to make our world a better place? And that's, for some of you, that's the world. For some of you, it's this world. For some of you, it's like just the immediate world around you. But how about we, to be a better person, do something to make our world around us a better place? And the question that helps us move beyond focusing on self-improvement and turning our attention rather than just self, maybe into more community transformation, it's a question that we discovered a couple weeks ago. We looked into the first chapter of the book of Nehemiah, saw a little bit of his story. And out of that, we came up with this, we have this question. And the question is this: what stirs your heart? What captures your heart? What grabs your heart? What is your heart moved by? What maybe breaks your heart? And here's why this is so important. When you and I find out, when you find out what captures your heart, what breaks your heart, what stirs your heart, you then can find out a little and have a little bit more insight into what your purpose actually is. Because here's the reality. God has called each and every one of us to make a difference, to use the influence that we have to make disciples. And when we make more and more disciples, the world becomes a better place. In other words, my life is not just about me. It's about more than me. You and I, we were made for influence. So I want to ask you again, what captures your heart? What grabs you? What stirs you? What moves you? What breaks your heart? And just so you know, when you answer that question, you will be faced with a tension within yourself. On one hand, answering and responding to the question will actually stretch you beyond you. But on the other hand, as we talked about last week, we're all life preservers. That's how everyone, it's like it's built in. We're wired to protect ourselves, right? Turn on the stove with a flame up high. 4 years old, different story. But you at your age, you turn that stove on, you're going to put your hand over that. No, of course not. You're wired to protect yourself. And so there is this element within us that the idea of taking a risk, some of us are risk takers, but by and large, at the end of the day, we're skeptical of risking too much. We don't want to give our lives away. We actually want to hold on to them. We want to save our lives. And yet, as we saw last week, Jesus calls us to something much greater than just maintaining our own comfort. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 16, verse 25. He says, whoever wants to save, everybody say save. Whoever wants to save their life will what? They'll lose it. But whoever loses, everybody say loses. Whoever loses their life for me, for my kingdom, for my priorities, who gives their life away, whoever loses their life for me will, that's where you find it. Jesus says the selfish, all about me life is a complete waste. And so it's important to figure out what captures your heart, what grabs you, what breaks your heart so that you can move into this place where you have more to show for your life than just you. Now, as we dig a little deeper into this question, what captures and breaks and grips your heart, we have a big challenge. Here's our challenge. We get stuck. We get stuck in that journey, and oftentimes we don't go beyond sitting here. In other words, we don't go beyond mental assent. We hear what we've been talking about. I think most of us would agree and say what we're talking about is important, but our tendency is to be content with knowing it, with believing it, rather than doing something about it. Now listen, of course, believing is important. Believing in God is important, but it's not the full picture. And that's what we want to dig in a little further with this morning, because Jesus calls us to do something with our belief. Believing in Jesus and being a Jesus follower, it doesn't mean that you know everything, that you got all the facts dialed in. It means that you live out those facts. It means that you put motion to your devotion. You put in action this love, this devotion you have to God. You put in motion your devotion to God. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 7, verse 26. He said, everyone who hears these words of mine, you're like, hey, I'm hearing it. It makes sense. I agree. Who hears these words and does not put them into practice is like a foolish, everybody say foolish. You don't put into practice what I've taught you is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. In other words, if you and I don't act on what you believe or what I believe, then you're just building your life on sand, is what Jesus says. John chapter 10, verse 10. Jesus said this, I have come to give you something amazing. It's something that's abundant. And he called it life. He said, I want you to have abundant life. I want you to have life to the fullest, real and better life than you can ever imagine. And that life, Jesus says, is way beyond mental assent, believing, or just agreeing. The person who doesn't act on the belief, they are missing out on the abundant life that Jesus wants you to have. Jesus says, you don't act on what I'm talking about? He says, you're just a foolish person. Your life is not built on the firm foundation of belief plus action. James chapter 1, verse 22 takes it a bit further, and James says this, don't just listen to the word. If you do, because if you just listen to the word, you're deceiving yourself. Rather, do what it says. Now, you've probably met some people in your life, and maybe you're one of them, where you've met these people, and they are so good at making great points. You know those type of people? I mean, man, they're really good at it. They have the answers. And oftentimes, these are the people who, they are good at shaking their fist at culture. They are good at piecing and parsing it, taking it apart, and they're good at pointing out what's wrong with culture and society, and they usually get big followings on social media. But the reality is, what is it? It's all talk. And they're not doing anything to bring about positive change. Here's the reality. The more time you spend making points and the less time you spend making a difference, it means you're just missing out on the heart of what Jesus has called you to do. If you're all about knowing, having information, sharing information, getting followings with that, but there's no action behind it, you're missing out on what Jesus called you to and the life that Jesus has for you, and you miss out on abundant life. And this brings us to one of the more challenging passages in Scripture, and it's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I'd ask that you turn there if you have a physical Bible or go on the YouVersion Bible app. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, a portion of it is read at pretty much every wedding. And yet, it's one of the most challenging passages in all of Scripture. If you're a Christian, when we read this probably ought to disturb you, what we're going to read. If you're not a Christian, you're about to get to some insight into why there's so many people who are resistant to Christianity. Let me give you some context here. The previous chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul had just talked to these Corinthian believers and told them, if you came to Christ, God has gifted you with special abilities. He calls them gifts. God has given you gifts to bless the church and to impact the world for Christ. And as great as it is to have this whole variety of gifts from God, of which some of them are spectacular and draw attention to yourself. And when you talk about gifts like the gift of healing and the gift of, they talk about this gift of tongues, speaking in other languages, when you start talking about that, they're things that are noticeable. And Paul says it's important to never forget what's more important than those gifts. You see, the Corinthians had a problem. They received these gifts from God, and they got excited about these gifts, and they got so focused on the gifts, and they got so focused on the gifts that they lost sense, purpose of what the gifts were about. They were more excited about the gifts than the purpose behind that and what God had called them to do. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is Paul's response to those who are focused on the gift that they had, which really meant they were focused on themselves. And they were focused on having all this insight and knowledge about these gifts. It was all about information for them without action. There was no motion to their devotion. So Paul is going to start off 1 Corinthians chapter 13 addressing those who basically think this. They think, God's impressed by what we know, as opposed to what we do and how we act. And so Paul's going to say, look, it is not believing that gets you there. It's not enough to believe. It's not enough to be right or correct. You have to do something with what you know. Otherwise, and what he says after the otherwise, totally disturbing, at least for me. And probably for you, and we'll get to that in a moment. So let's set it up. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1. Paul says this. He says, if I, and Paul's pretty brilliant. He doesn't say if, anybody? He doesn't say if you. He really means you, because he's talking about the Corinthians. That's what he means, but he's trying to be a little polite here. So he's like, all right, hey, if I. But really when he's talking, he means you people, you Corinthians, you church. He says this, if I speak in the tongues, and that word tongues there is a Greek word which means known languages. He says, if I speak in the tongues or languages of men or of angels, but I do not have, what's the word? Love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, what is he talking about here? He says, if I have this, which he's really meaning if you have the supernatural ability or really gift, like Paul just talked about in the previous chapter, if I have the supernatural ability to speak in multiple languages I never studied, I never learned, God just gifted them to me. He gave me this supernatural ability to speak in these languages, to understand these languages. Now again, this whole passage is hyperbole, so Paul's doing that to make his point. He says, not only can I speak to people in their languages without ever studying those languages, he says, but I'm so good, I can even talk to angels in their angel language. Now, of course, if I'm reading this, I'm probably like a little kid and I'm getting distracted going, angels, they speak in languages? What's their language? Is different than ours? And like parents oftentimes when you're trying to lecture your kids about something they did wrong and they bring up random things, and especially when they're really young and you're trying to make a point and you're like, they're just randomly getting off and they're missing it all. And anybody know what I'm talking about? When you have little kids, you're like, oh my goodness. And so I'm kind of like that too when I read this, but bring it back to what Paul's talking about. It's not my point, Paul says. Pay attention. Let's imagine you're so connected to God that you have the ability to speak in these languages, all sorts of languages, and even angel languages, which must be a sign that you're close to God. But if I don't have, what is it? If I don't have love, and this Greek word for love, that's what this was written in, this Greek word is the Greek word agape. There's 3 different Greek words for love. This is not the Greek word that means a sexual type of love. It's not the Greek word that means the emotional type of love. This word here, agape, is a love that is action-oriented love. It's an others-centered love. It's the love where, you ready for this? You actually do something and you just don't sit on what you know. Later in this chapter, Paul's actually going to then define. He's going to give the examples. Here's what it looks like. And that's the part that we're not going to read it today, but that's the part when he says, love is kind and patient and all that forgives and hopes. That's the part that describes this action-oriented love. And again, we usually read that at people's weddings. He says, if you have this most intimate, awe-inspiring prayer life, this connection with God, you're praying, you can speak in these languages. But if you have all that, but if there isn't something happening in your life where you're doing something as it relates to other people and loving other people, if that's not a part of your life, you're simply a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. In other words, if your life is just about you, God says you're nothing but noise. Again, disturbing, isn't it? Paul, how can you say that? Paul's answer is if there's no loving action towards others, then that means your life is all about you. My life is all about me. Wait a second, Paul, are you discounting the importance of my devotion to God? No, I'm not discounting it. We're just not stopping there. What I'm discounting is measuring your devotion to God just on how you and God are doing. That's what he's talking about here. Because if your devotion to God, if your personal prayer life, if you're falling down on your knees during worship, lifting your hands, tears in your eyes, you know the Bible inside and out, if that's your life, Paul says, you could come across as deep and spiritual, but you need to understand that's just noise to God. He takes it further in verse 2. He says, if I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, man, you're the person who people come to you because you know and you have insight. And they come to you with their biblical questions. You're the person who people looks at you and think, man, they are so deep and they're so spiritual. Paul says, even if you're educated like that, or you have that supernatural knowledge where you can just fathom mysteries, to which you might say, well, isn't that kind of cool or important, or isn't that good? Paul says, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying if you stop with that, if it's still just about you, you're just missing it with God. Your life is just an annoying noise. Verse 2, and if I have faith that can move mountains. Hold on, Paul. Now you're talking about faith? Now you're saying, hey, great faith isn't important? Paul's saying, no. I'm just saying great faith is incomplete. You might be that in-tune person with God. You might have the biblical knowledge, or both. You might be that person when you speak, man, people follow. And their faith grows when you speak, and they develop a confidence in their faith because they see that your faith is so big and so bold. And so people latch onto that. Paul says, even if you're that man or woman, if your life does not express itself in agape, servant-oriented, others-oriented love, Paul says, if that's not what your life is rooted in, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, but if you do not have agape, love, servant-oriented love, here's the offensive part. You are, and basically he's soft selling it because he doesn't say you. He says, I am what? Nothing. But he really means you. That's who he's talking about. I'm nothing without agape, action-oriented, others-focused love. Now, this little Greek word for nothing, I'm going to teach it to you real quick. Everybody say, ooh. Everybody say, ah. I don't know why I said that. Maybe that's with kids. So let's go back to, everybody say, ooh. Everybody say, dice. Put it together. Ooh, dice. That's the word. I am nothing. I am dice. It's almost like the word is verbally comes out like, doesn't that sound like that's a problem? If I look at you and say, you are dice. I mean, that just sounds like there's a problem, even if you don't know the language, right? I'm dice. I'm nothing. You know what that means? It means something of, ready for this? Of no importance or concern. In other words, without love, agape action, others, servants oriented towards others, not just about me, Paul says your life is no good because it isn't doing anything for anybody else. You can think you're right with God. And all of us on some level probably have that. Hey, Jesus took care of it for me. I'm right with God, not because of me, but because of Jesus. And you think you're good with God, but the reality is, here's the other part of the definition. If there isn't agape, action-oriented love, you are, the other part of the definition of dice, you are spiritually nothing, spiritually empty and void. It's the very opposite of what you think you are. He says, hey, Christians, if you're good, if you're content with being full of knowledge, thinking you're close to God, have the ability to communicate and make amazing points, and you have some good insight and knowledge, and you have this great faith, you and God are good, but you never make a difference, don't think for a moment Jesus is impressed with you. Just because you're right doesn't mean that you're righteous. You're dice. Dice. Like I said, it's disturbing, isn't it? That's disturbing to think about. Well, then he goes on to continue to drive his point home even more. And Paul, again, he's just doing like crazy off the chart hyperbole here. And so let's continue with his illustrations. He says, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 3, if I give all I possess to the poor, which you might think, okay, well, that sounds kind of a cool thing. But Paul's really describing a person here who's still focused on self. Because the way he's talking here, the emphasis is on the giver, not what he's actually trying to accomplish. If I give all I possess to the poor, and then to make his point even more, Paul goes completely out of the realm of reality. And he says, and if I give my body over to hardship that I may boast. In other words, let's say, first of all, I give everything I have away to the poor. And then I go even further. I sell myself into slavery. That's what this is talking about. I sell myself into slavery, and then the proceeds from that, I also give that to the poor. I can do all that. But if I do not have love, I gain nothing. We already looked at what nothing is, dice. My life means that my life is really no good. I'm spiritually empty. I'm void, dice. But notice the word in front of nothing. It's the word gain. I gain nothing. Gain is the Greek word ophileo. It means providing benefit or profit or help to somebody. It's accomplishing a goal that is useful or adds value to somebody. So Paul is saying, without love, agape, without action, he says, I'm providing no benefit. I've accomplished nothing in my life that is useful because it hasn't added value to anybody else but myself. He says, no matter what you know, no matter what you've experienced, if there isn't some part of our life where we step in, where we wade into the messiness of other people's lives and get involved with other people's lives, if that's not a part of our life, this is the disturbing part. Paul says, you're just nothing. Your faith has no value. Your life is not of no benefit. You're not useful. Why? Because that means then your faith is just all about you, and that's not an option for God. It's not about me. It's about more than me. That's what God has called us to. If it's just about you, that's unacceptable to God. Again, it's a disturbing chapter, or a disturbing few verses that frankly would be easier not to preach. Because there's a lot of yous going on, which is why he kept saying I. Now, some of you might need to hear what we're talking about this way. Devotion to God does not stop at our moral perfection. Hey, I'm working on me. I don't sin a whole lot. I really try to avoid sin. I have a clear conscience with God. Look at all this that I avoid. Look what I've done for me to make me a better me. Paul says, great, do all that stuff. It's wonderful, but that's just the introduction. Because if all you do is make you a better you, if it goes no further than you, the reality is you're just an annoying version of you. If it's all about you, all right, pretty annoying to the rest of us. And the reality is that's not abundant living in Jesus. That isn't the life that Jesus came to give you. And I can tell you this, I don't want an annoying version of you, but here's the reality, neither does God. True faith is authenticated. True faith is demonstrated by loving action to others and for others. Is that what your life represents? Now, let me pause for a quick moment. Speak to those of you in this room who your faith journey as you're trying to figure this God thing out and Jesus thing and church, you're not necessarily, you wouldn't consider yourself a Jesus follower yet. If you're one of those people and you just feel like we've communicated a message to you that, by the way, God never intended us to communicate. So I would say if we've communicated accidentally a message that says, hey, we Christians, we're better than you. We've got it all together, and as soon as you clean up a little more, we'll welcome you. I'm just telling you, if you've experienced that, that's not the message of Jesus. That's a message of a bunch of knuckleheads who haven't figured it out. We messed it up, so we apologize. I can tell you this, Jesus didn't come to create and set up some country club for perfect people. Maybe you've heard this idea of Jesus came, that the church is really a hospital. It's a whole bunch of people who are broken and hurting, and there's a lot of messiness going on. I'll tell you this, and I know this to be true, whether I know your situation personally or just 30-something years in ministry. This room is full of messiness. Now, we do a good job of hiding it and covering it, and there's all the reasons. But if we're real with ourselves, inside there's a lot of messiness. And so how about we be people who are more like Jesus? Because the reality is maybe people who don't know Christ, they resist us and they resist the church because of the way we've communicated and handled things. But here's what I know for a fact. Jesus himself was irresistible. Read the Gospels. All types of people came to him. Why? Because who wouldn't want grace and forgiveness and unconditional love? Everybody wants that. But the message that we sometimes communicate to the world, that's not irresistible. And that's why Paul had to say, your devotion is good. That's great. It's important. It's just not the whole picture. It's not enough. It's not all of what God has for you. And so if you don't love outside of your comfort zone, if you don't put your devotion to God in loving motion, you're just dice, spiritually empty and void, because it's all about you. And you're phileo, just of no benefit. And nothing successful is coming from your life. Harsh words, but it's reality. Now let me try to put a twist on this with a little different angle, and then we'll try to wrap it up this morning and wrap up this series. Let me ask you it this way. What are you most grateful for? When you think about God, what are you most grateful for? God's sinless perfection, his holiness? Or are you most grateful for God's sacrificial intervention into our life? If you had to choose, I think I know what most of us, if not all of us, would choose. We are most grateful for God's sacrificial intervention into our lives. That's what we sing about. That's why tears flow from our eyes during worship or when we're reading the Word. That's what moves us, God's sacrificial intervention into humanity. It's not when we hear Jesus is perfect and you need to be perfect. Doesn't mean that's not true, but that's not what rises up on the inside. What makes something well up on the inside is when we hear that God sent his perfect Son into our mess for our benefit. He sent him into our world. It was God's loving action, his intervention into our lives, his grace, his mercy, his love. And that's what lights me up. And I imagine that's what lights you up. The Bible says it's God's kindness that is what led us and leads us to repentance. At the very center of the gospel, it's not about believing something or even what God believes. It's about what God did. So your devotion to God, my devotion to God, it's just not complete until we put our loving devotion into motion. Nobody resists the church because the church is too loving or too welcoming. Nobody does that. Nobody resists Jesus and the church because we're open and gracious and kind. What people find easy to resist about Christians is that we come across as like we know it all. And we're so holy and righteous and devoted to God, and it comes across like we're better than everybody else. And Paul says if that's your Christianity, if that's your approach to following Jesus, he just says you're dice, nothing. Because that doesn't benefit anybody. That only benefits you. That's not abundant life. Abundant life is putting motion to your devotion to God, which means you step out of your comfort zone, which means you step up for the sake of others. Listen, you hear all this, you don't have to quit your job, but you might have to quit something that has been an important part of your life, but it's not a part of your future. You don't have to leave the country, but you may have to leave move out of the country, I should say, but maybe you have to leave or move out of your comfort zone. And I don't have to move away from here, but maybe I go on a mission trip. We have one this spring. It's been since COVID. We used to do them every year for almost 20 years. And COVID hit, and it's been a while to get it back rolling. We're going to head out this year. And some of you say, you know what? That's putting my love in motion. I'm going to make a difference in that way. You don't have to give all the time you have, but it's time for some of us to give a little more of the time that we do have. Some of us, you don't have to give all your money away, but maybe it's time that you give a percentage away. You don't have to stand on the street corner and preach the gospel. But you know what? You can be intentional about how you connect with others so that you can be the light and the love of Christ, so you can embrace the influence that God has given you. And so for some of you, how about you sign up for our How to Be an Intentional Influencer seminar? It's going to be starting in a couple weeks. And you say, hey, I want to maximize my influence for the glory of God, and I want to have someone help me think about that and process it. So, new year, this is it. January's about up, so time to stop talking about this stuff. So go ahead, get in shape, eat right, get out of debt. It's all good. Go for it. But don't stop with you. Love God, read the Bible, pray. But don't stop there. Why? Because as we said in week 1, you have no idea what hangs in the balance of your willingness to embrace what it is that captures your heart and then choosing to do something about it. Choosing to do something for others. Making a difference. How about we turn our belief into action, to real love? So church, I believe God is calling us this year to love in such a way that it does change our world around us. That's what God has for us. So will you join me? Will you put your faith your devotion to God, will you put it in loving motion? That's what you've been called to. So what captures your heart? And what are you going to do about it? Let's pray.